All right, let's get started. Thanks for everybody who's joining right now. If you would like to, you can sort of watch from one of two places, either the Evolving Architect site where everything's sort of been embedded, or you can watch straight from YouTube on the unlisted video. Thank you for joining me today. Just a second here. Okay, so for anybody who doesn't know me, I am Mike LaValle, and I will be presenting the workshop today. The workshop Wednesday is your first SketchUp house, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them throughout the hour for the chat, and I'll pretty much just go through and show you some tips and tricks, some workflows, and if you have any ideas or anything that you want to know more about, then really just feel free to ask anything, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. So here we go. All right, so you guys are all here because you want to know more about SketchUp, and I think that's great. So what this is really just call it your first SketchUp house, because it's supposed to be that first sort of project that gets you going, that gets you started in SketchUp, using it a little bit more. And this is a workshop Wednesday. And really all that is it's a brief and informative session to help you evolve your architectural career. This is supposed to be really for you to grow your skills in a very quick way. I do this once a month, and it's brought to you by the AIA Buffalo, Western New York Emerging Professionals and Evolving Architect. Basically, the EP committee is really involved in trying to promote emerging professionals. It could be students, recent grads, young architects, basically just trying to advance their careers. And Evolving Architect is my website and blog, and it's partnering with this as a way to promote more content like your first SketchUp house. So for anybody who doesn't know me, I'm Mike LaValle. I'm an architect in Buffalo, New York, and I've been blogging for about the last year or so, and I'm starting to also create these webinars and things like that, so that I can expand how I'm able to help people. And this workshop series is really a part of that. So I try to do it pretty much the last Wednesday of each month. So today, October 26th, we're talking about the SketchUp house. So you're in the right place if you're looking to advance your general knowledge of SketchUp, you want to understand the workflows for 3D modeling, or you're just awesome and want to know everything you can about SketchUp so you can improve your skills. And like I said before, I think that this is really going to help you if you've already sort of started looking at SketchUp. It's going to be somewhat basic. Maybe we'll touch on a few advanced concepts here, but I would highly recommend looking at the other workshop that we did last month, which was an introduction to SketchUp. It could help you a little bit more, just understand the interface and things like that, but this is sort of that next little step to keep you moving. I begin with an idea and then it becomes something else. I really like this quote, and it sort of speaks to what we're going to be doing this evening, because we're going to start with sort of a general idea of what this house might be, but I'm going to show you a couple different ways to get there and a couple different ways that you can create the house in SketchUp. The first thing to really understand is that there's not just one way to model in SketchUp, even though The way I described it in the last workshop was, you think of SketchUp, if you didn't participate in that, as a way to 3D model almost as though you're working with paper. It's a hollow model type. It's not solid modeling. It's not like sculpting in the same way you would with clay. It's more like folding and bending paper. So I think that the thing that's interesting and something you should just keep in mind as we continue to develop the models are that, you know, we could end up kind of anywhere, and we could end up there in several different ways. And I'm going to just show you a couple different paths that you can use to suit your own way of modeling. So what we're going to do now is I'm actually going to open up a model. Now you can sort of work with me in SketchUp as you're going, or you can choose to just watch me. That's fine too. I think most of these things are going to be relatively straightforward tasks that you can sort of practice on your own after this. And there will be, you know, sort of a recorded version of this so that you can come back and watch the video again if you want to. Again, I fully recommend that you ask questions if you have any as we go, because a lot of this is sort of, you know, I think the benefit of being here is that you can really ask me anything that you want to as we go. So this is a very basic model that I've already started in SketchUp. And, you know, the one thing I would say about it is that it's just a very generic house. It's not anything too particularly special, and it's not necessarily even finished. But this is kind of the what we want to end up at the end of this evening. So really what we have here is what I would say is a paper model, basically. If I start to take away these faces, you can see inside. You can kind of rotate around and look inside, and you can see that this is all hollow. And if you're familiar with SketchUp even a little bit, you can kind of see that this is generally what the models look like. So what I'd like to do is actually start from scratch to some degree. I'm going to hide this, and I'm going to hide the chimney that we had there. So the first thing to note is that you sort of have these scale figures here. For now, we're going to actually hide her, and we're just going to start from scratch. And what I'd like to do is basically just lay out sort of a similar shape to what we had there with that other house. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start drawing a line. I'm drawing a line along this red axis, and I'm going to type in manually 30 feet. It could be, you know, another dimension if we want it to be, but, you know, I'm going to just start with a very basic module, because I think what we'll find is that, you know, I'm just going to keep moving around and making basically an L shape. I come back here. Now, if I highlight this point, you can kind of line everything up. You can see that this the red axis has been activated, and everything is starting to excuse me, connect to each other. You just complete the connection, and you have the shape is already filled in, and this can sort of be our foundation for the house. Now the different ways that I want to discuss to model in SketchUp, now that we have our base, are the first one is sort of free flow. Think of it as modeling on the fly without sort of any rules or regulations or anything like that. So I'm just going to put off to the side just so you kind of get an understanding of what I mean. If I just start making a shape here, and I start extruding it, and you don't need to necessarily pay attention to what I'm doing in terms of how I'm making this figure, but just know that this is one type of modeling, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second for some more context. So this is all one sculpted thing. It's sort of an interesting figure that is just an abstraction of different surfaces that are connected to each other, right? So this is one type of modeling. The other type of modeling is to use layers. So we're gonna I'm gonna bring in my default tray here, and let's see, let's show. Turn on my layers. All right, so I need to add it to the default tray. So you can see that this is on layer 0 right now. And really what we want to do is we want to start creating, let's just say we're making, let's just make a simple box. And we will extrude it. And then we want to put something else on another layer so that we have some separation here. We'll change which layer we're on, and we'll start drawing in this layer. And we'll start editing in this layer and so forth. Now you can start actually, start turning on and off these layers, and you can still see that, you can still see that the layer that's active is on, but the one that I just turned off with everything else that was on it, the original layer, turned off with it. Now, for some more context, I'm actually going to just take this piece and move it away, just to make it a little bit easier to see the separation. So if I turn this off, this is, one piece. Now it's two pieces. The reason why the surfaces went away was because the surfaces actually were created on this layer 0, and we can change this so that the whole thing is on layer 1 if we wanted to. So now when we hide this, all of the faces and the lines that were created are on layer 1, and the layer 0, which was the original one, kind of turns on and off. So that's the second way to model. I'll put this back over here. The third way to model is actually with groups, which I highly recommend because it's the way that generally, if you think about it this way, the other two layers, are more of a 2D way of thinking when you're drawing and you're drafting. And I tend to use those when I'm either in AutoCAD or in another program like Photoshop even, that relies on whole sets of information that can sort of be grouped together, but you want to do it on the fly with major pieces of information. But the way that I actually like modeling even more in SketchUp is with groups. And the difference between layers and groups is that let's just keep on the original layer for a second. If I start making this other piece, we'll say with my third model, I'm going to create a box, and right now I'm going to make it a group. Now the reason why this is important is because I can actually take this group now, and this is sort of an extra tip. If you hold down Control, you can do this in other programs I think as well, but if you hold down Control and you select Move on the group, you can duplicate it and move it around, and it's just a group. It's not a smart object that relates to the original. It's just a carbon copy that once you have made the copy, you can change it however you want. But the advantage here is that I can start doing things like this, where if I want to, so I'm in this, if I go into this group, I can start making the forms fit together. And there are reasons why you would do this. If you think about the way that a building is constructed, you want the forms to physically be able to sort of meet each other and fit within one another or around each other or next to each other or things like that. So the layers can work. You can start to definitely group things and layer things. But the one thing I would recommend probably not doing in your more complicated models is this first one, which is the more free flow way of modeling. For today, just to kind of see some of the other tools, this is actually the way that we're going to model, but I did want to showcase the options to group and to layer your information, because I think it's definitely very helpful to know the different kinds of workflows that you can have as you move forward. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete these now because we don't need them. And so now we're back to our house, and I grouped this originally, but I'm going to explode it so that it's one object. And we're just going to go through a series of different commands. They're not really commands, but they're more button-based. And you can see in the interface that there are a whole slew of things. I think primarily what we're going to be using today are the draw tool, which is this pencil. We're going to be using the select tool. We'll be using the move tool, which is this sort of crosshair series of arrows. Push-pull, which is an arrow coming up from a box, so it's sort of like an extrusion. And we'll also be using the follow me tool a little bit. So if we just start with our house, I think that the easiest way to go is to just start extruding things. I think, we can come back and I can maybe show you, if there's time, another way to approach this. But for now, what we'll do is we'll actually use the extrude sort of push-pull command here. And we're just going to basically, so I started by, you can either select the push-pull tool first and then select the surface you want to push, or you can basically select it and then come back to it. Sometimes I like selecting it first so I know which one I'm selecting, just because when your models get very complicated, it's hard to see and tell like what is really going on there. But basically, I'd say that, what we want to do is extrude this up. And what I'm going to do now that it's still locked on to the command right now, I'm going to press in manually, say 11 feet. So now we have kind of the base level of our house. And just for some context, we'll bring that person back in. Actually, maybe we'll make it a little bit taller for now. Why not? We can do whatever we want here. This isn't real yet. So let's say we want to, let's just get the basic form of the house done, right? So we have our L shape here, and the one thing I would say that you should be aware of is that there are endpoints, which will highlight green. I know that it's not necessarily showing up that way right now very well, but when you hover over an endpoint, it'll turn green. If you hover over a midpoint, it'll turn blue. And basically, if you can click on any one of these, and use those as points of reference, sort of like you would in a normal drafting program. So for our purposes here, to make the ridge of the roof, we're going to take the midpoint, because that's where your ridge would be on a gabled roof. And what I'm going to do, just to make this even simpler, is I'm just going to pull this line all the way past the farthest edge. And I made this an L configuration just to show you something a little bit more complicated than just a straight run of house with something that's happening a little bit more dynamically at the roof. So now I'm going to go to the other edge and select the other midpoint because I know that's where I want the ridge to be there as well. And I'm going to take this line and I'm going to, it doesn't even need to go past the farthest edge. I just brought it to the edge before so that it was easier to kind of line up. But if you pull this from one point all the way over, you can basically connect the dots. And then what I'm also doing here, just so you know, is every now and then we're going to clean up the lines. We're going to just take these lines out because they're going to either complicate the geometry later or they're just not necessary. So if you see me doing that, that's what I'm doing. If you see some lines just randomly disappear, that's what I'm doing. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to gently click on both of these lines that we've created. And the thing to know about SketchUp is that because everything is sort of interconnected, as long as SketchUp can rationalize the polygons, it will create them. So now, like I said, we're going to use our move tool, and I'm going to select this edge. You know, it's already highlighted, but I don't want to move it from another point. I want to move it from the edge just because it's a little bit easier. You can move it from other points, but honestly, when you're moving physical objects, it's easier to do it from the object itself rather than a place that's arbitrarily in space. So now what you're going to see is because I am, and you can see below what I'm moving up and down, there's a blue line, which means that I'm aligned with the blue axis, and the line is still selected, so you can see everything move up and down. Now, you can see what's happening here just for effect. This isn't doing anything I wanted to do. This is a kind of a weird way of moving this line around, or at least it seems weird because SketchUp doesn't really know what to do, but it's trying to connect all of the faces and the lines together. But what we're going to do just to help SketchUp out is we're going to increase this by, since I made everything 30, let's just make this 15 to cut the difference. So I know that the scale of the house doesn't necessarily look quite like what it's supposed to be, but we're going to, we'll be changing things as we go. So now that we have and actually, you know what, let's just change it just so that you can see. You can select the lines as long as you can, basically if you go left to right with your cursor and you left click down to select things, as long as it hovers over the entirety of that object that you want to select, it will select that object again. So, for example, if I wanted to select more than that roof, I could select these other pieces and what have you. But let's say I don't really like where that ridge is and I want to just change it right now. I can just select those two lines and move it up and down if I want. So I'm not locked into that other way of modeling. Let's say I want to move it down, 2 feet. It's not quite there. I can keep doing it because it's still, you can see the blue line. Oh, close in here for this. You can see that this is more of a blue line, and you can continue to just basically change it if you want to. So maybe that's a little bit better. It's a little bit closer. So let's make the edge of our roof right now. Because right now this just looks like a piece of wood or something like that, but it doesn't really look like a house. So why don't we fix the end of our gable? And what I'm going to do is, see how I'm sort of hovering along this line? I'm doing that because I want the computer to understand that I want to basically extend this line past, and you're going to start to get a magenta kind of pink color. That means that you are parallel with the line that you've sort of just selected. And what I want to do is I'm just going to bring this down another, it doesn't matter, 18 inches. And from there, I'm going to go down another 6, let's say, and I'm just going to return this back. And I know that this is perpendicular to this plane because this is on the green axis, which is what this line is on. So I can just sort of tell that this is all going to line up. It did, and it created a surface. It won't create a surface if it's not somehow able to rationalize this. So if it doesn't work for you, you'll know that it's not working, and you'll know why. So what I want to do is I want to actually make a parallel line here so that I can sort of get the end of the gable working out, so I have a nice edge and it's not just this blocky face, so it looks a little bit realer, or more real. And what I want to do, I could do this a couple ways. I guess I'll show you 2 ways that I'm thinking off the top of my head. You could click somewhere on the face, and you see how basically this shows this becoming this line that I'm extending perpendicular to the edge. Well, that's good because it means that I'm basically, in line with that other line perpendicularly. And now I have something to work with, because before I couldn't really make a parallel line. I mean, I could, but this is one of the ways, without selecting the line, there wasn't really a way for me to make a parallel. So now that I have this, I can sort of, let's say I want to take this down maybe 6 inches. Now I have 6 inches, and I have an even increment, and I can run this again parallel with the roof edge, and I can connect these back down, and I can kind of erase all of my bad pieces. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to quickly take this, and I'm going to copy, and you know what, I'm actually going to do this I'm going to select both of these faces, and I'm going to copy, and I'm going to paste. And what that does is it basically gives me the pieces, the geometry that I've selected, and allows me to move it to wherever I want. So let's say I just want to move it here. And for an easy way to reflect to this, I'm going to group it, and I'm going to just hover over, basically these arrows allow me to rotate in whatever plane I want to. So if I'm rotating around here, I'm rotating around the z-axis, and if I'm rotating on, I can rotate around the y if I want to. I just have to find the little arrows. So basically what I'm doing here, though, is I'm making the mirror here, and I'm going to explode this so that's there. And just so you know, one of the things to keep in mind is, and maybe you've noticed this, maybe you haven't, the outside of our model right now is white, and the reason why that is because it's a positive normal on the geometry. And what that means is that the surface actually has 2 sides. It has this sort of, by default, blue-green other side, which is the negative normal, and then there's the positive normal, which is this white side, which is what you see basically most of the modeling create as you go. The reason I mention this is because you want all of your model to be white except for anything that's basically showing, so that on the off chance that you start to use this for rendering or something like that, your materials will show up better. They'll show up properly, and you won't get as much finicky sort of oddities that are, a product of it being backwards. So what I like to do, just to keep this all pure and sort of how SketchUp wants me to model, I will right-click on this, and I will reverse faces. Sometimes this will correct itself when you extrude the face, sometimes it won't. I just mentioned it so that you're not creating models that are all blue and white, and then you don't understand why it's not rendering properly later. So that's a good tip to just, be aware of as you move forward. Try to make sure that all of your models are white. And honestly, you could do it the reverse way as long as it's consistent. So you could actually have the negative normals, depending on the way you choose to model. You could actually do it the opposite way and have everything be negative, but it just needs to be one or the other. And since most of the SketchUp tools will default to positive normal, that's what I tend to use. So now we have, the two edges. The other way, I'm just going to delete this real quick because I did say I was going to show you two ways. So the other way to do this is just to select this face, and you can just simply, excuse me, you can simply use this offset tool, and from the edges you can sort of select very simple, basically it's taking the outside shape and it's creating something new for you, as an outline inside. You can actually take it outward and it'll create more surface for you, which is kind of fun. But you could do basically what I did before and just, let's say 6 inches. The thing about this is that now we have a frame around the surface, which isn't particularly what we wanted, but it's sort of close. So what you can do is you can either, you can do a couple things, but basically what I would suggest is from here, kind of hover over that edge that you've created because we know it's parallel, we know it's right, and then just kind of delete this other information. You don't need it. You don't need to keep it there, and you can just do the same on this other side. There you go. Now, I didn't delete this line here because it's actually part of the 3D geometry. And now what we're going to do, because we have the shape back again, is I'm going to use that follow me tool, which is basically, it's a way for you to take geometry and extrude it around a line or about a line. So I'm basically going to select the face I want to extrude, and I don't want to just extrude it in one direction. I want to extrude it around the house. So if we select that and then we click follow me, if I just click it, it'll go to the end of that first line segment. But if I just go undo, if I sort of hover over the line that I want to have the geometry follow around, I could make these weird shapes. I could go all over the place, but what I want to do is I want to just create this roof edge. So for basically what the gutter would be. And now I have a roof edge that goes pretty much around the whole house. And I want to do the same thing here. I'm going to drag it around. There I go. And now I can clean, because this is all sort of worked out, I can take that line out and I can clean up these other lines if I want to, which I'm going to because I just want to. So anyway, so now I'm just going to do real quick, I'm just going to make this again, and I'm going to do the 6 inches. I'm doing this faster just because you sort of understand how I did it. Get rid of this geometry, don't need this all, and as I'm doing this, there are different ways to sort of bring this all together, but this is just sort of the way I've chosen to do it this evening. I'm going to extrude this just to give this some form on the edge, and I'm going to do this again here. So now we have something that looks a little bit closer to a house, right? We have something where it doesn't look necessarily just like a block anymore. We have a little bit more definition to our roof, and the fun thing here is that even though there are more lines, I can still do what I told you before and start moving stuff up and down. Now, the thing to realize here is that I can't move the angle up and down too much, because then you'll start to see the change in the deformation in this lower angle, because these aren't changing. However, let's say I like this roof angle, but I don't want to change the sort of the even nature of this 6 inch piece. I can select the whole thing, the whole roof basically, and move that whole thing down so that everything starts to work out a little bit closer. So let's say that I want to move this down to like 2 feet. It's fine. You know, it's still sort of an odd shape, but you know, at least you know that you can start to play around with those things and get just the way you want it to or how you want to build it. So what we're going to do here now is we're going to add some doors. So let's add, you know, let's say we want the front door to be here because we're going to have a garage on this side. What I'll do is I'll sort of paste this out so that I have, I don't know, 2-3 feet from the edge. And I just made a line from here to here. Now, the thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go up the wall 7 feet, or let's say instead of that, let's do 7'2". And then we'll do 3'4". So we have a 3-foot door plus we have our door frame. And I'm going to do basically the same thing that I did before, except now we're doing it for the door. So 2 inches for this. One thing you can do to sort of hide the geometry and sort of let it go is you can take this edge and start to blend it with the other geometry here. So now I have a door frame and I can start to extrude this back, let's say 2 inches. And I can move this back even farther, say to another 4 inches, or move this back to another piece. Now, again, this is not ideal because, as you see, this is just shaping sort of the outer, I guess, wrapper of what this house is. But if you were going to do this properly, you could actually extrude the geometry to, you know, for the entire door frame, and then have the door separately. Just as an example, I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to create this again. Now, because I just locked that in the first time, it has the same number there, so I can just click it in. And now I'm going to group this. And I'm going to offset it 2 inches. And once I've made the geometry again, it's always important to group outside in. So group outside and then in. The reason why you wouldn't do it the other way is because you can actually start to get, if you have some weird things happening in your geometry, it's actually more difficult to start grouping things the way I'm doing it. I guess as your geometry gets more complicated, there's more potential for you to have cracks. Like there could be a crack here, and if I just start trying to group this whole thing, it won't actually give me a nice frame and then a door, but it'll group the whole thing again, and it'll leave the lines behind. So if I, get rid of this group, you'll see that those lines are separate and not in the group. So that's why it's important to go outside in, because you can see that there's a frame, you can see that there's a door, and now they're both separate groups. I can extrude this, this is its own thing now. I can either use this as a flat plane because it's easier to model and easier to work with, or I can give it some depth, but it doesn't really matter, especially if you're doing just an exterior rendering. If it matters for what you're trying to end up with in terms of a real model, then maybe you would go with the thickness and try to make it more real. But this is the difference between this and the other door. The other door is just a sort of an extrusion in this surface, but this is actually a door that now it has its own sort of life to it. So I'm going to get rid of that. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to say I want to create some windows. I'm going to basically take this. I created a 3-foot sort of datum because I wanted to make sure that I had the window at the right height. And let's just say we wanted it 3. Now, if I right-click on this, something that's interesting, if I right-click on this line, is you can have you can divide it. So you can divide it into a couple pieces, and it'll start doing it in segments. You can read, hopefully you can see this, maybe it's too small, 11 segments, and it's actually dividing the geometry perfectly into those increments. So if you start with some nice, like here, for example, I'll show you, because I started with 30 feet as my width. If I divide this and I divide it into 3 segments, 10 feet is left over for each segment. So that seems like a fairly nice spacing. Maybe I want it a little bit more separate because there's 2 bedrooms there or something. Now I'm going to create 4 segments, and they'll each be, excuse me, an even increment away. And we can see that they are 7, 6. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to create this on the surface by itself, because it doesn't matter where I'm creating this. And let's just say I'm going to make a 3x3 window. So I'm going to draw a 3x3. Now the thing that's interesting, because this is all just a surface, is it doesn't matter where I do this because it's all still on the same surface, and SketchUp doesn't really care because it's not like I'm doing, you know, something off of the plane. It just knows that the geometry is on that surface, so it's not going to start creating lines from like this corner to this corner and this corner to this corner. If I do, then it'll start, you know, moving the geometry into more complicated ways. But I just mentioned that because you don't have to have this perfect. So now that I have this sort of more modular 3-foot window, I can sort of just click on the move command and click the middle point of this bottom edge and just place it right there. So now you have a 3-foot window, and you can take this, and I'm going to use Control again, and I'm going to move it over and basically just place it over here. So now I have 2 windows, and I'm going to sort of just well, I'll just leave this geometry here, because I think what I'll do actually is I will start to create an edge around the whole house. But now all I need to do is do the outline again. Let's say that now something you might have noticed is that there's a tick mark here, because this is actually an endpoint that I've created, because we created this originally from the 4 segments. If you ever want to get rid of that because it's going to complicate your geometry later, you can simply select it and then draw a line from that to another point. If you erase that and the geometry is okay, it will get rid of that point, and it will make this segment basically whole again, so that there's no endpoint anymore. It's just a midpoint in the middle of your line segment. So the reason why that's important is because if you see what I'm doing here, and I'm extruding this just back, and I extrude this back, you'll see that I start to get this other geometry here. We don't really want that because it complicates everything else, and it makes it harder to go back and sort of change things, just like the edge of the roof earlier. The more geometry you have, the more complicated it is to change it later. So let's just get rid of this here, and I can just sort of get rid of that other point too. So I'm going to offset this, and I'm going to, doesn't matter how far I do this back, but let's just say this is some increment. You can kind of play around with this on your own too. But I'm just doing this for an example, just so you can kind of see. So now we have some windows, and just for, you know, some little detail, and because this is not a true model, I'm just going to add in some mullions. And you know, this is just a quick sort of roughed model. So you could come back in and add as much detailing as you wanted to the windows, but this is, you know, this is the first house, not the 50th house, the first SketchUp house. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, I'll show you a neat trick. So if I want to take if I want to make this line go the whole way around my geometry, and I know that this is the same section here as it is up here, I can take this surface and I can do the same, how I was saying, you can take basically if you press Control, you can move this away and create another surface. Well, I'm going to do that, except I'm going to create it and then I'm going to move it upwards. And it's going to create a perfect line around everything. The reason why I want that is because I'm going to make sort of like an edge, bottom edge to the whole house. And now I have, it's an even edge. I can use it like, well, maybe this is stone, maybe this is, some sort of lap siding up here. Now I can sort of create these guides for the windows and for the doors. And I went back in and I just quickly erased the geometry that was here just to get rid of it because I don't need it there. But that's a kind of a quick, easy way to do that. Now let's say I want to make this a garage. So just start, basically roughing out this shape here, and I'm going to just quickly make I want to make this. This is starting to get sort of odd in terms of its shape, but let's just say this looks sort of fine. So now we've made a garage door, and same thing as the other door. I'm just gonna sort of bring it in, make this. So I can do this one first if I want to. 6, something. Okay, so now we have a garage door. Fantastic. All right, starting to look like a house. Not necessarily the best designed house ever, but it looks like a house. So that we got that going for us. Let's give it a chimney for no other reason than we just like fireplaces. So let's say 6'6". That's pretty generous. I don't know, 3. Oh, sometimes that happens. Only meant to do 3 feet. So as I'm going here, I'm manually putting in increments just because it's easier to sort of understand kind of where, like all the, if you're making a house, you don't want to make them out of arbitrary numbers. So, the thing to keep in mind here is that we're trying to make something that is still buildable. It's a little bit odd and a little bit quirky, but we'll just do it this way. Now, the one thing I have done here, and I'll say this is, kind of goes against the way that I started modeling this, but I made this just for ease. I made this actually a group first because in order to get that geometry for the chimney here, it's actually easier to make it a separate geometry. Just extrude it to wherever we want it, and then just sort of let it be. So like let's say that looks fine. It's sort of weird, sort of a weird chimney. But let's, maybe it's higher than that. Maybe it's another, whatever. Maybe it's too much. This is all sort of up to you. And the reason why I would leave something like this a little bit different, and this is where you can kind of blend the ways that you model, is, it helps you understand the differences between the geometries. This is such a different geometry here with the chimney that it demands almost itself to be a new thing, because I can still go back and change all the other stuff around it. Like let's say I want to change, the other thing I could do is I could actually just select these faces. We didn't do this before, but I could do this, and now our 6 inches has become, 3'6", but all 3. And, this is a little bit cartoony, but, as I move this up and down, the chimney sort of is allowed to kind of easily stay as its own piece, and that's helpful, especially when the geometry is so different. That's ultimately the reason why I like, using the groups, because you can start to change and manipulate pieces by themselves. And the thing that does become a little bit more complicated is like when you start making those objects and you start placing them in physical walls in SketchUp, it does become a little bit more cumbersome, because you need to make sure that the opening for the wall is whatever it's supposed to be. But the reality is that you can just move this wall back and move the other wall back, or move it up and down, and as long as the puzzle pieces sort of fit together, it doesn't really matter anyway. And I think that ultimately is the better way to make your model. But this is a first house. This is like I said, this isn't your 50th house. There's going to be a lot of things you'll learn just as you make more things, and this is just a first pass. So what I would recommend is that what I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute this model basically to everybody who signed up, which, thank you again for showing up for this. I'm going to send you this model so you can see all the stuff that we made and understand all the stuff that we've talked about. And what I'd like to do is just go into some question and answers. I think one of the things that I'd really like to show you guys right now, before everybody leaves, is I want to show you what a house looks like that I've done, that isn't just my first house. It is my, I wouldn't say 50th house, but it's definitely a more complicated house that I did for a competition that I'm really happy about. I did it a couple of years ago, but I did it as a way to explore, different ways of modeling. And this is not your first house. Again, let me stress this. This is more complicated. This is, there's more stuff going on. But as I sort of zoom in and around, you'll understand that, you can start to play with the landscape. And one of the questions that I actually got from people who wrote in before was, how do you deal with undulating landscapes and complicated landscapes? And one of the things you can do is, it's sort of the way you would deal with those site configurations, as you're designing your house, is you need to sort of figure out, like, where is your structure going to be? Where is your vantage point going to be in the model? Like, for example, this area isn't resolved in my model. It's not resolved in my model because I don't care, because the money shot, which I have actually labeled money here, is right here, and I don't need to see the other edge. I don't need to see it, especially in my other viewpoints. So let's go through a couple of these. You'll see that there's some more complicated stuff going on. You can get a sense for, it's a little bit better view up here. So get a sense for like all the different lighting, and I don't have a lot of textures in here because this is actually a model before the final model, but I wanted to show, there's a lot more kind of detail going on here. This whole thing is actually a group. It's all group. I'm going to turn off the shadows right now. You can see that this is a group. It's different from the landscape, which is its own other group. And I don't have all the other site things in here because the purpose of this model was to create renderings for a competition. So I didn't need everything sort of figured out and done. I just needed stuff done to a level where I could, really explain the design, really explain what was the concept, what am I trying to do here, and there's so much more going on here than you could ever really start to think of as a very beginner, but basically what I'll show you here. So I have, just so you can see, you know, I have all my columns organized together, my floors, my glass, my kitchen, you know, the kitchenette, all the equipment itself is grouped together. The mullions themselves are grouped together. The people, the entourage, all that other stuff is grouped together. So you can kind of see how complicated this could get. And, you know, that's another example. So, you know, I think that the other thing to consider here is that there are opportunities with plugins. One of the other questions that we had was basically, you know, what are the plugins that are available to create some of this stuff? And, you know, I think that a lot of the plugins work more with the pro version of the software, where you have to actually purchase SketchUp. But for the SketchUp Make, which is the free version, you know, it's definitely very good just out of the box, where I haven't really ever needed to use too many plugins like that. But instead, I rely more on the sort of the methods and the workflows that I've used with the groups to create whatever I need. I mean, unless you're doing something with parametric geometries or things that think like Frank Gehry designs or very sculptural things, I sometimes don't even do that in SketchUp. I will do it in another program. So, you know, I would just say, you know, if there aren't any other questions, because I don't think I see any in the feed. You know, I just want to say thank you again for being here. Thanks for being awesome. And if you have any more questions, you can email me or you can just visit the site. And I hope you got something out of this. And we will have another Workshop Wednesday next month. So I hope to see you there. Thank you for joining and have a good evening.